Welcome back. I don't know about you guys, but I thought Chapter 6 was a real banger. Let's talk about theater history. Sorry about my kids in the background. They're making a lot of noise. Deal with it. I have to. So, Chapter 7 is called Theater Traditions, East and West. We've been kind of referencing theater history throughout the semester a little bit. More so with the UTD kids. I call you kids. I know that you're fully functioning adults. It's just, I taught high school for a long time. It's a habit, sorry. We've been referencing theater history. We talked a little bit about Greek and medieval theater practices, getting us up to the idea of doing modern plays and stuff. This is a more formalized discussion of theater traditions. This one's going to be long, probably. So just bear with me. So, how did theater begin? That's a great question. The answer is nobody knows for sure. Sorry. That's the best we can do. Trying to understand how theater began is kind of like if you took a baseball and you threw it into a stained glass window and it blew up all over the floor, and then you had to try and put that window back together with tape, right? You probably wouldn't have all the pieces. Some of the pieces are shattered. You're not going to be able to use it. So all we have are pieces of evidence that can suggest to us the complexity of something, or an idea of something that's really quite complex and something that took a long time to develop, both in the East and in the West. But really starting kind of as one similar space of and modality of performance that kind of separated and went off into two different directions. Some of the earliest dramatic performances that we have record of actually come from Africa, alongside in the northern Africa area, alongside the Nile River, and these are as much as 5,000 years ago. We're talking about 3,000 BC kind of time, BCE. That's a long time ago. We're talking about ancient, biblical Egyptians, way back when. Some of the earliest happens in that era. We have, stuff painted on vases and plates and stuff that would suggest that they were doing performances. But honestly, we think that African theater is even older than that. There are indications of ritual style performances in the activities of literally hundreds of tribal groups that are ancient, and they date as far back as 6,000 BC. So we know that stuff was happening. How it got to be a formalized thing called drama, we don't really know, but we know that it's a combination of ritual and the development of storytelling as a part of what we call the oral tradition, meaning at some point we got written language, but there was a whole pile of time before that where stories and traditions and histories of people were passed down, right? So there would be some kind of a person, an elder in a tribe, who would have all the stories, and they would teach the younger kids and the younger generations of the storytellers the history of the tribe, and they would tell these things in ceremonies and various initiation rites and all kinds of stuff as a way to remember who they were as a people and to teach and pass down their traditions. So we know that was going on way long time ago, 6,000 BC-ish, from drawings and cave paintings and other types of things like that. So what is ritual? How are we defining what that means? Ritual is a very important part of the way we understand our earliest performances, and even still some today. Excuse me. Obviously, a ritual is a collective ceremony performed by members of a society or a tribe or a group for religious or cultural reasons, right? Most of the earliest rituals were about summoning gods, gaining the gods' favor, getting rain to fall, victory in battle, having lots of babies in the tribe so that they can continue their own, to grow their people, so on and so forth. Tribal rituals also arose to observe important moments in life, rites of passage, the changing of seasons, all other kinds of things, marriage, birth, death, coming of age. And in point of fact, historically speaking, even some of our own contemporary religious rituals, things like baptism and bar mitzvahs, so on and so forth, are actually descendants of some ancient tribal ceremonies that have just kind of been passed down and have been repackaged along the way with new faith systems and whatnot. But those structures, those actions, those ritual actions, those performative ritual actions have been with us since the very beginning, for a very, very, very long time. Now, over time, those tribal rituals began to incorporate elements that we would consider theatrical in some way. Things like simple staging and costumes and makeup, which we talked about in our design chapter, how costuming and makeup go way back to the very beginning, right? And it's important elements of character. But things like music and dance, eventually formalized speech, etc. And not all rituals that have come down to us are religious in nature. You know, we've got secular rituals, things that have larger than life dimensions to them, like wrestling matches or the black formal robes of a courtroom. The changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, I think, is an interesting one that the textbook talks about, as well as like us saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, those are formalized rituals that are not religious in nature. But it's important to understand that ritual is at the heart of the very origins of theater. It is the act of performers recreating and intensifying and making myth meaningful, right? To them, to their society, or to their world in some way, right? To their some way to enrich and enhance and give meaning to their collective lives together. Likewise, storytelling is a major part of that. You know, it's more personal than ritual performance. Because it generally relies on like a single voice to tell a story, right? Not like one physical voice, but like one singular point of view voice. And so you get a single point of view inside a story that drives that story and makes it meaningful. While ritual attracts an audience, storytelling only requires one person, right? And so you have this concept of a person or group of people listening to a story, as well as a collective body observing a ritual performance of some kind, a dance, a singing, a chant, whatever it might be. And you can start to see the idea of the basic elements of theater coming into view, right? Becoming clear, not murky anymore. And those things have been around since the very beginning. Now, the most ancient form of theater, as we understand it, began as dance dramas, right? Those first appeared on the African continent and traveled to cultures around the world, and they continue to be performed all over the world in various places and in various ways. Those performances tend to revolve around the idea of gaining favor from divine spirits. Belief in the power of spirits to animate objects, is also called animism. That is sort of a catch-all term that deals with some of the basic religious impulses of tribal culture in prehistory. And this idea that we could imbibe something with characteristics or with life is a basis of character as well. Humans who assume an animistic role, right, mediating between spirit and earthly realities, are called shamans, right? We still have those today. In those ancient dance dramas, because the shaman's state of performance, or his meditation state, or trance state, would lead him to otherworldly realms, right? His performance takes on a magical quality or a mystical quality. And things like costumes and body paint and hairdresses and masks disguise the shaman performer. So it transforms the performer into a character, into a mythical character, a mythical spirit. And we see some of those things going all the way down to modern times. And in fact, the masks that were used in those rituals, those early rituals, have outlived the rituals themselves in many cases. And today remain the prominent symbol of theater in the world. The comedy and the tragedy mask, you see those two together often. Those are ancestors of the earliest forms of ritual drama. That's just important to note. Now, from the standpoint of traditional drama, like as we understand it, we have to kind of look at the beginnings of theater in the West and theater in the East, because they are fundamentally different from each other. As I said at the beginning, theatrical performance almost certainly began in sub-Saharan Africa, where we can even still today see huge amounts of traditional drama in which ritual and storytelling continually interweave. In fact, I showed you some video of that early on in the semester, of those community dance dramas where the performers are taking on animal spirits to tell stories and tell myths, right? That's what that is. So it kind of began in Egypt, as we said. But those performances eventually sort of drifted northward up the Nile River into Egypt, and then spread kind of into Mesopotamia and Canaan and throughout the Middle East. The very earliest, first known Egyptian drama from that time period is something called the Abydos Passion Play, which in some ways is kind of like an early immersive theater, because it was very, very medieval in the way that it was set up, in the fact that it would be staged along the river, and there would be a boat procession. And the performers, the audiences would get on the boat and ride up the river, and the performances would be performed at like a procession. It's so fascinating that's something that we still see today, sort of progressive theater, moving from space to space to see theater. That is something that comes from the very earliest forms of drama. We also have, from some of our modern anthropology, discovered that that Abydos Passion Play was in the springtime, and it was about the resurrection of the god Osiris, the death and resurrection of Osiris into the god Horus. And those springtime resurrection dramas became a thing really early on, and at the beginning typically celebrated things like the coming of spring, the birth of vegetation, reproductive rights, not like women's rights, but like the right of reproduction, like rights, rights, to symbolize death and rebirth, death and resurrection. And we have seen that taken on down and repackaged again and again and again and again and again into what we just did this past weekend, right? Which when we celebrated Easter. Those mythological structures have been present with us from a theatrical history from a historical standpoint, since way back when. So drama did not continue to flourish in the Middle East for a number of different reasons. Most of the theater tradition there had disappeared by the 3rd century BC. And because of, historically speaking, the rise of Islam in that area, which traditionally views pictures of humans and gods and visual and performing arts, pictorial representation of spiritual things as irreligious, theater could not survive in that way, in that space. However, it did move on, and it spread into what became the areas of Greece, Attica, India, places like that. And those cultic rituals sort of took hold in those areas. And we're talking about a time period of like about 600 BC down to about 350 BC. And we see the rise in that space of what we understand to be Greek drama. A lot of that, by the middle of that time period, was happening in Athens, which, over the course of about 150 years, produced 4 of the greatest playwrights the world has ever known, and some of the greatest dramatic theories that the world still holds on today from Aristotle. Greek drama established the formal foundations of Western theater, and it shaped and defined the essential concepts that we've already talked about, the ideas of what is tragedy, what is the purpose of tragedy, what is a comedy, what are the rules, so on and so forth. Those things have shifted over time, but the essential structures still remain the same. The idea of spectacle and pity and fear and catharsis and masks and music and dance and things like that. All that stuff that Aristotle talked about way back then is still very much important today. And so it cannot be overstated, the importance of, from about 600 BC down to about 400 BC, that time period, that 150, 200 year time period, produced some of the greatest theater that the world has ever known. And we're talking about 2,500 years ago. So it's really interesting and can't be overstated. So a little bit about Greek theater. Aristotle tells us that Greek tragedy arose from something called the dithyramb. That was basically an ancient rite that consisted of wine drinking, phallus worshipping, the chanting of ancient poems, and all of that was surrounding the idea of honoring the god Dionysus, right? Now, Dionysus was a demigod, one of the 2 harvest gods, and he was the god of wine and fertility. The other one was Demeter, who was the god of like the harvest and corn and things like that. Demeter was a whole other thing, though, not important here. The other demigod was of the harvest was Dionysus, god of wine, god of fertility. So you can imagine his festivals were a good time, and who, according to myth, had arrived by way of the Middle East. Right? You see how things are connected. Dionysus was a Greek counterpart of Osiris, the god that we talked about earlier from the Abydos Passion Play. And like the Egyptian Greek god, he was believed to every spring be killed, dismembered, and then resurrect. So the Greek version of that god, Dionysus, was worshipped every spring in a festival called the City Dionysia. And the City Dionysia was a 4 to 5 day long festival in Athens where people would come from all over the region for this revelry. And at these festivals, they would stage plays, competitions. And so playwrights would write a series of 3 tragedies and a comedic satyr play, and would submit that as an entry into the festival. And so they would award prizes for the ones that were the best, and the winners. So there were hundreds of playwrights. Of those, 3 survive. three tragedians survive. And that would be Aeschylus, who wrote the Oresteia, the earliest known and surviving trilogy that's complete. Missing a satyr play, but the trilogy of tragedies is complete. Sophocles, who wrote, obviously, Oedipus the King and Antigone and those. And then Euripides, who we've talked about a little bit as being so radical and coming a little bit later. The only 3. We have 7 plays from Aeschylus, 7 plays from Sophocles, and we have about 17 from Euripides, including the only existing still satyr play, which is called Cyclops. Anyway, a little bit about Greek tragedy. Greek tragedies explored the social and psychological religious meanings of the ancient gods and the heroes of Greek mythology, right? As well as current events that were happening. Comedies, on the other hand, presented contemporary issues that were affecting everyday Athenians, not just the gods and mythic heroes. Both types of drama were staged first on simple wheat threshing floors, areas of the ground called an orchestra, with what they would call some sort of a dressing hut, right? Like a place for them to go and change costumes and stuff. That became something called the scene building, or the skene. The skene, S-K-E-N-E, the skene. The audience sat on an adjacent hillside called a theatron, which we've talked about, which means seeing place. As Greek culture expanded, huge amphitheaters were built. The whole thing's called an amphitheater. We still use that term today to describe outdoor theater spaces, amphitheater. Some of those places, as we've mentioned, could sit as many as 5,000-6,000 people. All ancient actors in Greece were male. They all performed in mask, and the mask would indicate the age, the gender, the character type, the personality. It would also amplify their voice. Early Greek tragedy was mostly chanted and sung, not spoken. In fact, most of Greek tragedy was. And that music has not survived, but the words have, and so we still have them today and can still perform them today. That basically means that because it was basically a foundation of music and drama, that it's also the basis of Western musical theater. That's a discussion for another time. Greek comedy, in contrast to tragedy, was the foundation of television sitcoms and burlesque and satire and bawdy, dirty humor. The only surviving comedian that we have, Greek comedic writer, is Aristophanes. And his work is referred to as Old Comedy. There were new comedies that came later. We don't have many of those. They have not survived. We do have some. Guy named Menander gave rise to the idea of the stock character. And the bumbling idiot servant, the cowardly warrior, and a lot of this is the foundations of what later became Commedia dell'arte, that stuff, which we talked a little bit about in Italy. But those things have stuck around since the very beginning. I'm going to stop this video because it's 25 minutes long, and we're going to restart, and we'll keep talking about Roman and medieval drama, and then coming right on up through the Romantic period.